Today's ancient witness comes from Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 31. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. God is not served by human hands as if God needed anything. Rather, God himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one person, God made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And God marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek God and perhaps reach out for God and find God, though God is not far from any one of us. For in God we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are God's offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now God commands all people everywhere to change course. For God has set a day when the world will be judged with justice by one whom God has appointed. God has given proof of this to everyone by raising Jesus from the dead."
I know I tend to say this a lot of times after we read scripture. It's like, this is one of my favorite stories from Acts, or from wherever in the Bible. But this truly is a very fruitful story, I think, where Paul engages with the philosophers in the town center of Athens, the Areopagus. Some of you have been there, I assume, this place, Mars Hill. Has anybody been there here? I know we have a lot of travelers. Yeah. Pretty interesting place, I'm sure. A lot of history there. This was the place where philosophers, poets, thinkers, scholars, and folks of higher status would gather and debate ideas, presumably with the shared goal of learning universal truth, seeking truth. This is the center, the birthplace, some would say, of Western thought. This is the culture of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And lest we, mentioning the word of Socrates, lest we over-romanticize the open-mindedness of Greek society, we have to remember that Socrates was executed for the crime of corrupting the minds of youth with unorthodox thoughts. So clearly, even in this broad-minded culture, it had limits for tolerating free speech. But anyway, so here is the Apostle Paul, well-educated Jewish rabbi, an evangelist for Jesus, diving head first into the marketplace of ideas. The text tells us that Paul is walking around the square and he notices these statues to various gods. He's troubled by these pagan idols, but he notices an altar entitled "To an Unknown God," and that is his entry point. That's where he begins to talk. He says, as we just heard, "I see you're a religious people." He affirms them. He tells a truth that they all share together, share in common. And I think it's true today. We are inherently religious, or maybe we should say spiritual. Let's say that. We are inherently a spiritual species. and it may get expressed in religion, but fundamentally we are spiritual. And Paul is then saying, and that I noticed you have an altar dedicated to an unknown God. Well, let me tell you about a God you may never have heard of. This God of which I speak is the creator of heaven and earth and of all humanity. This God has set within all peoples in all times and places a desire to be known. And then Paul quotes one of their own Greek poets, in this God we move and have our being, and we are the offspring of this God. Now, Paul says, let me reveal to you this God you do not know, this God who raised one Jesus from the dead, and through him the world will be judged. And then we are told that some scoffed, and some wanted to hear more. And Paul even got a couple of converts that day. Someone named Dionysius, a member of the town council, and a woman named Darius, presumably of high social status, if she would have been in that context. And then it even says, and a few others. Okay, so this story takes place 2,000 years ago. What we have come to call Christianity was not even a thing yet. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even a religion, really. It was a fringe cult of the Jewish faith. Paul is operating, we might say, with a clean slate. He didn't have to apologize for Christianity, since Christianity institutionally didn't yet exist. He didn't have to deal with the sorry baggage of Christian history that we have to account for. He didn't have the baggage of shame around the Crusades or forced conversions and genocide of indigenous peoples or colonization, or biblical justifications for chattel slavery and the kidnapping of Africans. He didn't have to be embarrassed by white nationalism or cross burnings and lynchings or native children being taken off to abusive boarding schools or child molesting priests and pastors. He didn't have to deal with a Christian society that has too often dismissed science and facts. He didn't have to apologize for homophobia and misogyny, although one can find tones of that in some of his letters, at least how we see it today. There wasn't any of that collective and embarrassing sin committed by the church in the name of Jesus when Paul was speaking to the Athenians. So it seems that preaching Jesus for Paul was a whole different matter than it is for us today. This is not to say that we don't have amazing representatives and collective movements of Christian faith that we can point to as very powerful and positive examples of a dynamic faith that Christianity is. The civil rights movement, abolitionist movement before that, inspired by Jesus. The amazing work of Mahatma Gandhi, a Hindu, mind you, but inspired by Jesus. The Catholic worker movement, inspired by Jesus. We can point to St. Francis, or Dorothy Day, or Daniel Berrigan, or Martin King, or your Aunt Shirley and Grandpa Will. Christian saints inspired by Jesus. But to bear witness to Jesus still requires us to deal with a lot of unpleasant and shameful historic baggage of church-rooted violence and pain. We have the challenge of publicly professing Jesus and God's love, while fundamentalist bigotry against women, minorities of all colors and religions, sexual orientations, and even the facts of science and history rage on. Why would anyone outside the church want to claim the name of Christian? That's a legitimate question. Why would anyone in the so-called secular world want to be associated with a faith, specifically one poorly represented currently by many of the I guess the term would be white evangelical faith, who, it's a fact, majority cast their vote for and put an unrepentant sex offender into the White House, and may very well do so again. How do we witness to our faith in this context? How do we witness to our faith? How do we claim the name of Christian when all this stuff, this, say, anti-Christian baggage continues to dog us? And I say anti-Christian, and it's a weird thing to say because it's not anti-Christian from the non-Christians, it's anti-Christian from the so-called Christians. Confusing, isn't it? I know we don't have to wear our faith on our sleeves, but neither do we have to hide it. In fact, we shouldn't. We need to figure out how to embrace our faith both with conviction and confidence and humility. There are any number of good examples of people who can model that for us and are modeling for that. I think of, just to name a few, the writers like Anne Lamott. I think of the Christian blogger Rachel Held Evans, who passed away recently. She represented evangelical faith in a new light for many. I think of the pastor Nadia Bolz-Weber, who pastors a church called House of All Sinners and Saints in Colorado. I think of Professor Cornel West, and I mentioned Cornel West recently again because he just, to me, he's a wonderful example of someone who can express unapologetic his faith in the public sphere while honoring and engaging everyone, no matter who. He will say, he will proclaim of himself, I come out of the prophetic Christian tradition. But that doesn't mean he's more right than anyone else from any other tradition. Everyone who, when he's talking, he will refer to as brother and sister, even people whom he disagrees, because he recognizes the inherent relationship of our humanity we all carry. We are all really brothers and sisters. It's not by profession of creed, but by the mere fact that we are created in the image of God. If we happen to represent our faith through a Christian lens, that's great. Claim it. Claim it without apology. But claim it with humility. So let's consider a few practical matters when it comes to bringing our faith into the marketplace. Let's consider how we might unapologetically and authentically and humbly engage, dare I say, speak about our faith beyond the four walls of the church. I'll throw out a few ideas. We need to authentically listen with the intention of being a learner. I'm not going to listen so I can one-up you. I need to listen so I can learn from you, and particularly people who may not identify with the faith. I need to engage people with deep questions rather than shallow ones. That can always be a little bit of an interesting thing to do. You know, I go to Trader Joe's and they'll always say, you do anything interesting today? And last time I was there last week, he said, did you do anything interesting today? And I could have just said, no, yeah, errands, blah, blah, blah. But this time I said, no, yeah, I talked to a woman who tried to kill herself and tried to give her some comfort, which is true. And I think he appreciated that. It was real for a moment. That's not something I do very often, have the opportunity to do very often, but this is actually a past member from another church that I served, and she's hit that place in her life where she's ready to give up. So people at parties will often say, so what do you do? But maybe we could say, so what gives your life meaning? What I don't know, what do you think happens when you die? I don't know. You could ask all kinds of interesting questions with people to get them to get to a more, a deeper level. We need to be authentic and vulnerable, and this is hard. Especially hard when we just get together, we do this time of worship together, and then we go out and about and do our thing. We have to find avenues and ways to become authentic and vulnerable to one another. We need to be addressing the real and basic needs of the world with a special attention to the realities and needs of the younger generations. That's the future. This church and many of our churches will not continue if we do not figure out how to address the real and basic needs with special attention to the coming generations. We need to honor the spiritual concerns that are fundamental, and I had said this before, I just said it yesterday, that themes for me of meaning, mystery, and mortality are really integrated into anything I might have to say up here. I'm concerned about what is the meaning of our lives. What does that mean in light of our short time on this planet? How do we make it count? And how do we humbly live within this world that is full of mystery, beautiful mystery, and some of it perplexing. And finally, we need to let go and let new people lead and innovate what church can be. And we really need to do that because it will look different. How do we let go, and how do we invite? And that's a big task. It's hard.